Good afternoon. So as you can see, there's a bit of a difference in the title change. The term LGBT has been removed. This was edited for a presentation at a Christian university. So I took it out. But the research is still the same. It's still the same content. But before I even begin the presentation, I'd like to preface that this is an ongoing research. This is for my thesis, my master's thesis. And also that my case study is actually Taiwan and Singapore, and South Korea is a possible expansion of the research. And as the research is still being written, the materials I'm presenting on South Korea is just cursory done for the research. Okay. So when we're looking at social policy, specifically here, what we're looking at actually is looking at the possibility of same-sex marriage in Southeast Asia. In East Asia. And basically what we're looking at is the process of legalization, how it becomes legal in a country. But before I get to the case studies, I'd like to orient the research within the larger global framework. So, as you can see, there are three processes of legalization. The most minimal case is referendum, which is one case in the Republic of Ireland, and the second most populous one is actually by legislative bills. So through Congress or Parliament. As you can see, there's a sea of blue in Western Europe, and then you have Australia and New Zealand. The third case, which is the concern of this research, is the judiciary, so through the courts, either the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court, depends on how the country functions. As you can see, most of it is in the Americas. Canada should be a orange as well, but that's a technicality siya. And then you have one in South Africa, and then you have that one lonely dot in Asia, which is Taiwan. In cases where the legalization has happened through the courts, these are the countries where LGBT issues have faced greater challenges and obstacles. So, for instance, there's no strong public support like South Africa, or you have a very organized political opposition like the United States. And what you see on this map is the value of the judiciary in rights advocacy for minorities. It presents as an alternative avenue for contestation. Basically, that is the significance of judicialization. So what do we mean by judicialization? Basically, the easiest way to understand it is the increased role played by the court in policy making. The transference of political questions into legal questions. So for instance, in the Philippine case, when you're talking about reproduction or the HR bill, instead of being legalized through the Senate or Congress, it's being legalized to the Supreme Court. So I will touch upon the process leading to judicialization as the presentation progresses in the comparative analysis. So these are the case studies. So let's start with them. So as I said before, the case studies are Taiwan and Singapore, and then possible expansion in South Korea. When we look at the literature on LGBT issues, there are three main factors contributing to either tolerance or acceptance of homosexuality. The first is affluence. The three cases here are some of the wealthiest countries, or if not the wealthiest countries, in East Asia. And there has been research that says that there's a correlation between affluence and tolerance, but that is based on the education attainment of the particular populace. So higher education has been correlated to greater tolerance of homosexuality. The second is secularization. What we mean here is religious practice. So there's studies, particularly in Europe, that shows that the more secular a country is, the more tolerant of it is of LGBT issues. So when you look at Taiwan and Singapore, particularly, they're not, comparative to other countries in East Asia, they don't have a very unifying religious concept like Catholicism or Islam. And like Buddhism and Taoism don't have a particular doctrine against LGBT issues. South Korea also has that to a certain degree, but I do caution to say that all three countries do have a very aggressive and very loud evangelical Christian minority. And I'll talk about that later on. Now, the second part is democracy. Again, there's been correlation that points that the longer democratic practice has been achieved in a country, there's also greater tolerance for minority rights. As you can see, there's an X in Singapore, and I will talk about that later, as part of the research actually looks at how a country's political regime affects how minorities fight for their rights. The other two things that the research actually look at is jurisprudence. So we're looking at here cases, court cases that actually have been established. So Taiwan and Singapore have court cases that have been finished. So they're concluded already. We have the opinions of the judges. So Taiwan finished in 2017. I think Singapore was 2013. There's a slight zero, like a faded yes on South Korea, because there are court cases that deal with LGBT issues, but they don't specifically point to questions of same-sex marriage. So it's kind of, we're going to infer the situation from there. The next one is civil society. All three countries do have civil society. Both Taiwan and South Korea have very strong civil societies. Singapore is more of a no, but they do exist, and it's a bit of a dance with the government. So, the framework. Basically, what the research uses, it looks at the effect of institutional structures on power dynamics, as well as how these same institutions, I'll talk about which those institutions are later, affect interest construction and strategy in policy formation. So when you look at it, this is how the research actually kind of looks. These are the three institutions we're going to look at and how they interact with each other. The institutional relationship that the research looks at are the overlapping relations between the elected branches, the judiciary, and then social movements. And it is this overlapping relation of these institutions that explain the situation surrounding the status of same-sex marriage in each case study. The political branches, just for clarification, is the executive and the legislative, treated as a conglomerate because the tensions within these branches impress upon the situation on the other relationships. Alright, so let's go to the relationships. So the first one I'm going to look at is the relationship of the elected branches with the judiciary. If you can see, these are the particular ones that we're looking at. So it's there's going to be the emphasis on the conflicting relationship between the elected branches and the judiciary, and the third-party role of the judiciary in mitigating the relationship between those two opposing, those two elected branches. In instances of political conflict, the position of the judiciary as the third-party mediator indicates its position within the policy-making process. As a result, the judiciary gains more relevance within the political process. So the more you have contestation between the executive and the legislative, the more the judiciary can actually assert itself in the policy-making process. So let's look at the case studies. So when you look at Taiwan, because of the party politics in Taiwan, it is very adversarial. So more often than not, both political parties go to the courts in order to settle political questions, so that you have the judicialization happening there. Now, as opposed to Singapore, you actually have a very smooth relationship between all three branches of government. So there is no conflict. And so you have very minimal cases or situations where the judiciary can actually assert itself, or that people can actually contest particular laws through the judiciary. So what you have is a very minimal exercise of judicial review. Now, when you look at Korea, there is particular cases that have happened as the cursory information that I've received. I'm just not so sure. I have to look at how judicialization or judicial independence is actually treated in South Korea. So that's one of the research questions that we have to look at, one of the facets. I put a question mark on judicial independence because part of the thesis or part of the research actually contests the concept of judicial independence. I put a question mark there because it is a political branch the state is treated as a political branch playing with other actors. So there is no such thing as independence. There's only a concept of choice in that question. So again, this is more relevant to Korea. As you can see, we have to see what the role of the judiciary is in divided governments in Korea. Again, looking at the party politics as well there, and then questions of how judicial independence is interpreted by the Korean political system. All right, the next relationship that we're going to look at is social movements and the judiciary. So when we're looking at, so I'd like to start on your right-hand side. When you're looking at locus standi, so locus standi basically means standing to sue, like how you can sue for rights. So if the judiciary accepts your petition, your legislation, your litigation, the legal guarantee of equality has been an anchoring point for a lot of LGBT issues. So if by that I mean, for example, when you look at Canada, the reason the way the Canadians received LGBT rights for same-sex marriage was through the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. So there was a legal guarantee, a legal document that activists can point to that says, look, this legal document says we have equality. So you can have an anchoring point. That was the research of Smith, but the opposite is also true. In situations where there's not a legal guarantee of equality within a particular country, it is very difficult for activists to actually advocate through the courts for their rights, as was seen in Australia. So Korea does have a legal guarantee of equality, Article 11 of their constitution, which is very similar to Taiwan. So it's just basically 2 or 3 sentences, very short, very encompassing. Now, if you look at Singapore, there's a lot of exemptions. The definition of equality is very long, and there are exemptions that's within it. And then, as the research have shown, the understanding of equality in Singapore is very determinant on the function of the legislation that's being challenged. So there is an understanding that in every law that you pass, inequalities are created. The question is, are those inequalities justified, and are they actually contributing to the social harmony? So that's how Singapore views it. So it's very qualified. So because of the lack of actual cases in Singapore, the concept of in Korea, South Korea, the legal concept of equality in Korea would have to be inferred from other court cases, and I'll talk about those court cases later. Have involving the argument of equality, how South Koreans understand what equality is, at least legally. To note, in the English translation of the Korean Constitution and the Korean Civil Code, from the Korean Ministry of Government Legislation, there is not a gender. Oh shit! 5 minutes lang pala. Sorry. There is not a gendered definition of marriage. So it's just parents. It's not mother or father. It's just individuals, not man and wife. So that bodes well for South Korea. Now, just going a little faster. So we have presidents. Presidents basically. Oh, fix. So presidents. When we look at presidents, what we're looking at is prior social movements. What has come before? And when examples previously, as argued by Voss in South Africa, you're looking at master frameworks. So, for instance, in South Africa, the argument for LGBT rights was dovetailed under the anti-apartheid movement. So it was swept under that. In the United States, the gay rights have been somewhat seen as the continuation of the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. In Taiwan, the LGBT movement has benefited heavily from the women's rights movement, both in legal expertise, people who are advocates for it. So there's overlap between the two. In Singapore, it's basically a no. There are no advocacies allowed in Singapore. In South Korea, I have to look at this little closer. But there are again there are social movements in South Korea which are very strong. specifically student social movements and labor social movements. But the modern social movements in Korea actually concentrate mainly on these four things: transparent government, election fraud, freedom of information, and eradicating corruption. So there is no talk about LGBT rights at all in the larger social framework. I also have to check on the women's rights movement in Korea, as the literature I've read on Korean social movements make no mention of women. So the prior cases. So let's look at the right hand side. So the Military Criminal Act 92.6 or 92.6 actually is makes it illegal for sexual intercourse between soldiers, whether on base or out of base. And that is the only anti-sodomy law that Korea has. And it has been challenged 4 times by activists, and it's always failed. And the main reason given by the courts in the constitution, the continuance of the statute, was maintenance of a fighting force and national security. And what it points to is the geopolitical consideration of South Korea against North Korea. But what about comparative to Taiwan? One of the theoretical reasons for the Taiwan support for LGBT issues is to create further distinction between them and China. And in addition, attracting continued support from Western countries that espouse the same liberal values. Now, there have been cases that have succeeded. So ban on pride events, registration for LGBT groups, but these are small. Okay, so this is the last part of the research that looks at is the relationship of the elected branches from social movements. And basically, what is being looked at here is the capacity of social movements to engage with and possibly influence political elites. Have the social movements been able to lobby for particular causes? Have politicians given public acknowledgement and support, either with verbal confirmation or agreeing to attend demonstrations? In the case of both Taiwan and Singapore, in the case of Taiwan, that's a yes. In case of Singapore, that's a no. And to a certain degree, I don't know if there are cases for Korea. Now the question is how you measure the results. One way to measure this is the political party mandate, political manifesto the political parties release, and any public declaration that the party might have given. Another measure would be social movements could get their own people elected to the legislature as either independent candidates or as part of the larger party. In Taiwan, they have been successful. It has been, in terms of political party support, LGBT issues has been taken by 2 of the major political parties called the DPP. And they have been the ones advocating for LGBT rights in Taiwan, as opposed to Singapore, which is controlled by the PAP. Basically, the party platform has said no. That's just the basic answer was no, until there was like a larger public support. Now, when we turn to electoral dynamics, political support for issue depends partly on how a particular issue will affect the change if the political party will be elected or re-elected. So if like the particular way that the PAP in Singapore have justified not supporting LGBT rights is their fear of losing greater public support come election time. So electoral politics has to a certain degree affect how minorities actually advocate for their own rights. When we're looking at South Korea, like no political party in South Korea has endorsed the promotion of LGBT rights. That's just basic of the situation. I have to look at how and why, or if there are small parties in South Korea that actually have taken the cause. But I do note on counter movements and religious activism. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there are very strong Christian movements in South Korea that have been sometimes tied to evangelical movements from the United States. And what we're looking at here is the capacity of these religious movements to affect the political situation and their capacity to bring block votes like religious organizations here in the Philippines. So in conclusion, South Korea is a likely candidate for judicial legalization of same-sex marriage. Because there is not strong public support, it's not going to go through the legislation. And also there's strong cultural conservatism in South Korea. And part of this has been attributed culturally to the Confucian system, the Confucian belief in South Korea, and also great gender inequality that still exists in South Korea. Another, again, is the organized Christian oppositions are very loud, very active, very well funded. However, I say that the existing legal principles in Korea are there. So you can actually make a judicial argument for the legalization of same-sex marriage. Thank you.